Today I'm going to talk about the workhouse in Belfast and the role that the workhouse played towards the end of the 19th century when Belfast was really expanding into a hugely important and incredibly large and vibrant city. This sculpture is from Banbridge and it's called Family Entering the Workhouse. And we can see from the body language here, the representation of the workhouse is something to be feared, something to be dreaded. And certainly the workhouse was something that people in 19th century Ireland did really dread. There was shame and stigma attached to it. But as I hope to show today, it also played quite an important role in some of the strategies for survival adopted by those who really did struggle to survive the 19th century city. Belfast Workhouse was on the site of what is now Belfast City Hospital. So any of you from Northern Ireland will be familiar with this hospital tower block that dominates the landscape. And that tower block was built on the site of Belfast Workhouse. And sadly, this is the only part of the old workhouse building that still survives as part of the hospital complex. So before we look at late 19th century Belfast, I want to take us back to the reason why workhouses were initially introduced into Ireland. Unlike the rest of the United Kingdom, Ireland didn't have any form of statutory welfare. It was overwhelmingly agrarian country, very rural, very prone to extreme poverty and famines, as I'm sure you're all aware. In the early 19th century, the extent of poverty in Ireland was so great that it was becoming a major source of embarrassment. I mean, Ireland had only recently become part of the United Kingdom, created in 1800. And to have such poverty, such extreme poverty in part of the kingdom was something that the government felt needed to be addressed. It was also pushing people to migrate to England and was therefore putting pressure on welfare systems in many English cities as well. So the question was, what was the best means of introducing some form of welfare to Ireland? And I suppose it wasn't seen as a means of alleviating poverty. Poverty was seen as the natural state of things. It was more, what do you do with the poor? How do you get the destitute who aren't able to work or don't work, off the land and stop them begging and wandering around the countryside? And after several years of reports, of debates as to what should be done, it was decided that the workhouse system that had been introduced in England in 1834 under the new Poor Law should also then be extended to Ireland. Many people argued against this. They said that the context in Ireland wasn't suitable for the Poor Law as it was evolving in England. However, despite all sorts of objections, it became law as the Irish Poor Law of 1838. And the idea being that it would be funded, the relief of poverty would be funded by Irish property, which was mainly Irish landlords, because it was such a rural society that really landlords were the only people that really had the wherewithal to support the poor outside of the main towns and cities. And it created a network of workhouses across the country where the poor would find food and shelter in return for manual labour. So it created for the first time in Ireland what became known as the pauper class, those who were utterly destitute and therefore dependent on the state for everything. And it devised the workhouse test, the idea that the only means of relief would be by being admitted to one of these new workhouses. Conditions were deliberately designed to be so unpleasant to deter anybody from using it unless they absolutely had to. It was a means of determining who was really destitute and who should be admitted. As well as conditions being unpleasant, families being separated on admission, and the level of food being so basic. The other main issue that was introduced was the idea of the stigma attached to having to enter the workhouse, the shame of becoming a pauper. And it was believed that this as well would deter people from using it.
I have no sound.
Unless they absolutely had to. So Ireland then was divided up into 130 poor law unions. Later on, that would become 163. And a workhouse was built in the main town of each union. A board of guardians was established in each union, and it was their role to locally administer the poor law. But they would remain under the authority of the Central Poor Law Commission that was based originally in England, but then very quickly moved to Dublin. As I said earlier, originally there was 130 workhouses built across the country, unlike England as well. When the new poor law was introduced there, we didn't have a system of workhouses in Ireland, so new workhouses were built in every poor law union. The building project began in January 1839 when George Wilkinson arrived in Dublin, and his remit was to design a workhouse plan and to have one built in every poor law union. The brief was straightforward. It was to be as cheap as possible. The commissioners stated the style of building is intended to be of the cheapest description compatible with durability. An effect is aimed at by harmony of proportion and simplicity of arrangement, all mere decoration being studiously excluded. So cheap and cheerful, but it had to last. Within 2 months, Wilkinson had devised plans, and almost every Irish workhouse was built upon these plans. Basically, it came in 3 sizes, small, medium or large, but it was the same design wherever you went. And we still see some remnants of workhouses across the country today. Quite often they ended up, as we shall see, being turned into hospitals. But there's an example of a gable end of a workhouse. Ballymena Workhouse is now the Braid Valley Hospital. And you can see then the other side, so tall, imposing, dark and very forbidding buildings. This is all that's left of Antrim Workhouse. It's the fever hospital, but it's ironic in many ways when you basically Antrim, what was Antrim Workhouse, it was razed and the site is now used for Tesco. So as you drive past the fever hospital, you see open 24 hours, every little helps. I don't think many visitors to Tesco realise the significance of that. The idea, as I said, of the workhouse was it was supposed to deter people from using it. Supervision at all times. People were supervised from the moment they arrived until the moment they left. And the actual design of the workhouse was such as to facilitate that. People were also classified from the moment they entered the workhouse into one of 7 categories. So you were either an old and infirm man, an old and infirm woman, an able-bodied man, an able-bodied woman, boys aged 7 to 12, girls aged 7 to 12, and then children under 7. And on entering the workhouse, depending on what category you fell into, you were housed in different parts of the workhouse. So segregation was a very, very important part of workhouse life. So families on entering the workhouse would be divided up. And as you will see here, sort of the sleeping quarters were very basic. So children would have slept in a completely different wing from the parents. They would have eaten in that wing. They would have exercised. They would have gone to school and all those things in a very different part from everybody else. Husbands and wives, likewise, segregated on entry and remained apart for their entire time. So this is just one example of a workhouse building, and it's a dormitory. And as you can see there's 2 raised platforms that run the whole length of the room. And basically on those then would have been straw and then very coarse cloth. And basically you just you find a spot and lay down. There weren't individual beds until really the end of the 19th century. So you were like squeezing up beside complete strangers every day, and the more people that arrived, the more people just had to squeeze in. So really very, very unpleasant place to be, and as I've said, deliberately designed that way. It wasn't called a workhouse for nothing. The idea was that nobody got anything without working in return. The idea of the workhouse was also to create a labouring class that wasn't dependent on relief, that would learn, as it were, to be independent and to work for a living. So you can see in the screen here some of the kind of work that people would have been put to. Men generally would have broken stones, which meant, you know, they would have got big boulders, and their work would have been just chip away at that, creating small stones then that would have been used for surfacing roads, etc. Digging in potato patches. The older inmates would have been put to picking oakum, which is basically taking a ship's rope and picking apart the threads, and the threads from that would have been used then to make wadding, cotton wool wadding, that sort of thing. And there's other jobs then that the inmates would have been put to as well. The idea again being that it was not rewarding work, it was tedious, and you would have worked for about 10 hours every day. The other way in which this idea of conditions being in the workhouse being less appealing than it was outside the workhouse was the diet. The diet was deliberately, again, designed to be monotonous, to be tedious. And it was only really in the 60s here, we can see in 1964, a new dietary that was introduced for Belfast inmates. And really, this is the first time we're starting to see some kind of a difference. From this time onwards, people maybe got something different on a Thursday and a Tuesday compared to every other day. But you can see for yourself there are minimal quantities, and it carefully worked out to be the minimum amount that somebody could remain healthy on, so that no money was wasted at all. So that's sort of the idea of the workhouse. And as I say, it was designed in such a way as to put people off using it. It was to be deeply stigmatizing. Certainly Irish workhouses gained a really horrendous reputation during the famine. The system was up and running just a few years before, you know, major humanitarian crisis hit Ireland in the form of the famine. You know, mass deaths, people flocking to the workhouse, cramming in, massive overcrowding, people bringing diseases with them, and people then dying in the workhouse from those diseases, and stories being told then of cartloads of bodies being taken away for burial in communal graves on a daily basis. So for that period of the famine during the 1840s and 50s, the workhouse was indeed a truly horrendous and horrific place to be, where many, many people died. But that was just for a short period. And what I want to look at then is, as we move into the latter part of the 19th century and the very early 20th century, what was the workhouse like at that stage? Who used it and why did they use it, particularly in Belfast? And when I looked at admission figures in Belfast in the latter half of the century, I was really surprised, because I expected that after the famine impact had died away, that numbers would start to drop and taper away. And by the end of the 19th century, we would have had very few people entering the workhouse. Actually, I found the opposite. And by 1910 in Belfast, there were 29 or 30,000 people per year being admitted to the workhouse, which I thought was a huge figure, and it really surprised me. I then looked at, to try and understand it a bit better, I looked at Ballymoney and Ballycastle, and I think Ballymoney is particularly interesting. It's a medium-sized workhouse in a rural town, probably about 30 miles away from Belfast. So it was looking at the indoor registers, I was able to trace how people were using the workhouse, how long they were staying, and you know, did this change over time? Now, if you look at the graph there, the red line's the interesting one. It's Ballymoney. And you can see from 1860 onwards that numbers are keeping high. They dipped in 1891, but by 1911, they're really going off the chart there in terms of the number of people being admitted to the workhouse each year. When I looked at the indoor register, so for anybody admitted to the workhouse, their details were registered in these huge volumes that are still available in the Public Record Office. Hopefully it'll eventually open again someday. But from an analysis of those, we can start to see how people were using the workhouse and how it changed over the course of the latter half of the 19th century. So when I looked at 1851, I saw that the kind of people that you would have expected to be in the workhouse were in the workhouse. So it was mainly elderly people, people who were ill, who couldn't work. And it was mainly women, lots of entire families. And once they went into the workhouse, they tended to stay there for long periods of time. And that is what you would expect, because these people had no alternative, no choice. The workhouse was the last resort, and once they went in, they tended to stay for long periods of time. But when I looked at 1911, I found a completely different use of the workhouse. The people that were coming in were nearly all young and fit. They all gave occupations. There were tailors, there were craftsmen, all sorts of things. There were mainly men and single men, so young single men coming into the workhouse. What I thought was really interesting is that the vast majority of them only stayed for one night. So if you look here at, this is again talking about Ballymoney workhouse, if you look at the length that people stayed in the workhouse in 1851, the top pie chart, you can see those who stayed for just 1 or 2 days, that little red wedge is a tiny part or proportion of those admitted. The vast majority of people admitted stayed over 2 months, the yellow wedge being from 2 months up to a year, and the purple wedge being 1 year and above. So most people stayed for months and sometimes years. But when you look at the bottom pie chart, 1911, you see a completely different picture. The red wedge now completely dominates the picture. The vast majority of those people entering the workhouse were there for 1 or 2 nights. So it was being used in a completely different way. A lot of those being admitted, as I said, their occupations were often registered. They were very often going somewhere else. So they were stopping at the workhouse and staying there for a couple of nights and then travelling on. They very often had a skill. They were tradesmen. 1881, Ballymoney workhouse admitted 7 plasterers, 27 masons, 38 tailors, 24 printers, 10 saddlers, a fiddler and a ballad singer. They all stayed for one night, and they all give their destination as Londonderry, Belfast, Coleraine, Dublin and Cork. So they were travelling all over Ireland, stopping at the workhouse for a night. One man was admitted, he gave his occupation as pickpocket, and he said his destination was Belfast, where he was going to look for work. So I felt the people of Belfast better look out. So when we turn to Belfast workhouse, we see the same pattern emerging. People coming to the workhouse and staying there for short periods of time. What I find interesting about Belfast and you know, the city in the latter half of the century, as I say, the population absolutely exploded. You can see here the growth of Belfast in the latter half of the century, from 1801 all the way through to 1941 there, but a huge population explosion. And the workhouse seems to have been used quite often by people who come to the city, who don't have anywhere to stay. Maybe they don't have relatives or they're not familiar with the city, and they go to the workhouse for a few days or a week until such times as they can find work or find somewhere to stay. Belfast did not have any kind of night shelter, so there was no alternative really apart from the workhouse. This was something that caused a lot of problems for Belfast poor law guardians who knew that this was completely contrary to the way that the workhouse was supposed to work. I mean, the workhouse was somewhere where you went when you had no alternative. You worked while you were there, and you only left when you had work to go to. So this casual use of it was completely contrary to the principles of the poor law. And also it meant that Belfast ratepayers were funding people who were coming to live in the city. And here we had one poor law guardian angrily saying in 1886 they had no right to keep paupers from Antrim and Newtownards in the Belfast Union. It was a great hardship. They were saddling the ratepayers with extra cost without making any effort to have a law passed which would compel them to keep none but paupers from their own union. Another guardian, he agreed. He said every time they brought the matter to the local government board, they were informed that where destitution existed, it was the duty of the guardian to relieve it. In Ireland, unlike England, there was no law of settlement. So therefore, a pauper could go and stay in any workhouse anywhere in Ireland. Another poor law guardian said Belfast has such a name that people came to it from all quarters. They brought their aunts and their uncles and their grandmothers with them, and when they took a house in which there was not room for these relatives, they sent them up to the workhouse. So there's a strong sense here among the guardians that people in Belfast are using a workhouse in a way that they have no control over and they can't do anything about. It was also very much a casual lodging house for some people as well. People came and went as and when they had nowhere else to stay. If the money ran out or they didn't have a job and they nowhere to pay, nothing to pay their rent with, very often they would go to the workhouse for short periods of time. And you're just taking 4 examples here from the registers, the indoor registers for 1900, 1901. I looked at 4 months. I looked at October 1900, January 1901, April and July, because the numbers are so vast that I had to sample them. And just taking those 4 months, Joseph there, who's 40, a labourer, he was admitted to Belfast Workhouse 8 times during that 4-month period. John L was a 60-year-old, he was an iron dresser, he turned up 6 times, and every time he was admitted, his address was given as somewhere different in the city. So we get a sense then of the poorest people in the city moving about all the time, just literally as and when they can pay for lodging somewhere, they'll pay it. But once they run out, then very often the workhouse was the last resort for them. Maggie as well, she was 30, a mill worker, and she was a widow. And she was admitted 10 times during that period, each time with her 7-year-old son. And again, every time she was admitted, her address was given as somewhere different in the city. And John here, a father of 4, his wife had died. And again, he and his children ended up having to come to the workhouse again and again and again. Another group that seems to have used the workhouse quite frequently were young mill workers. Belfast's industrial and economic growth was really built on linen and the linen industry, and the latter half of the 19th century saw a proliferation of huge linen factories developing across the city. It was one of the things that drew young women in particular into Belfast. But very often those women came hoping for economic independence, hoping for work, and very often that didn't materialise for lots of different reasons. And for those who were working, if they fell pregnant or they got ill or other reasons and they didn't have other people to depend on, they really were left with nothing. There was no security, no safety net for them. So a lot of young women whose occupations given as mill worker or something connected with linen production ended up coming to the workhouse. Another group of women were those who were single and were either admitted with illegitimate children or they were pregnant when they were admitted. In Belfast, again, you know, the very high number of instances of single pregnancies was going to be a problem in a city where there were lots of young women coming to the city for work. In a total, in October 1900, there were 28 single pregnant girls admitted to Belfast Workhouse just in that 1 month. And another 51 were admitted with illegitimate children. For young women like these who were in search of work, who were out of work, or as I say, who were heavily pregnant and didn't have any family support structures or community support, the workhouse really, no matter how horrific it was as a place to be, did represent an important option for them and one that many had to resort to in the absence of anything else. Belfast Workhouse also seems to have been a place of almost semi-permanent accommodation for some of young women or sometimes older women in the city who give their occupation as prostitute. And this caused concern for ratepayers and poor law guardians who decried the workhouse as a place of immorality. And there were, throughout the 1870s and 80s, the pages of the press were constantly full of angry ratepayers complaining about the workhouse being a den of iniquity. But it did actually end up being an important refuge for women whose, as I say, occupation was given as prostitute. And we see women coming in and out on a regular basis, maybe leaving for a night, taking their children with them, coming back in again the next day. For women who were ostracized by families, the workhouse did represent shelter and a refuge. What I wanted to do then is move from the people using the workhouse to looking at specifically at one role that the workhouse played, and that is in medicine in the workhouse. And the workhouse infirmary grew gradually to become a very important hospital. And as you've seen from the start, eventually became Belfast City Hospital as we know it today. Early nursing care in the workhouse was invariably in the hands of female inmates. So paupers who would have been admitted to the workhouse were given the job of looking after people in the infirmary. And very often, for example, these people were illiterate and they couldn't read, and that would be a problem when it came to administering medicine, for example. They were untrained and they lacked discipline. There's repeated I suppose, reports of drunkenness among nurses. Brandy was supposed to be there for medicine and medicinal purposes, but it definitely appears from the reports of the workhouse master that wasn't always what it was used for. And Belfast, as a large city, was also the workhouse was difficult to manage because of the sheer numbers of people coming into it and the range of sicknesses and illnesses and injuries that they came in with. Because so many people were flooding into the workhouse, it meant that overcrowding, particularly in the infirmary, was a major problem. And it seems to have particularly caused issues around people's health. And you can see here, for example, this is just a snippet of a report from one of the workhouse medical officers. He said that basically because there were so many people in the workhouse that people were getting sicker rather than getting better. Apparently there was supposed to be a certain amount of cubic airspace allocated to each pauper in a workhouse hospital in order for them not to get even more sick, for it not to be unsafe. And Belfast fell far beneath the recommended standard. And you can see here the doctor saying ulcers will not heal. They dread to perform an operation lest erysipelas or other diseases attending and overcrowding would attack the patients. They add that on many occasions they found it necessary to discharge patients before a cure had been accomplished. And they observed that illness either came to a standstill or it retrograded. Another report several years later showed that there was no improvement, and the inspector at that stage said, and I quote, he visited the workhouse on the 14th and he found that there'd been a very considerable increase in the number of inmates, with the exception of the fever hospital. Every part of the institution was overcrowded. It appears that the number of inmates exceeded the number that was allowed by 568. So there were 568 people more than was considered safe. In the infirmary alone, there was nearly 200 people in excess of that limit, and 95 of them were sleeping on the floor. Sadly, some of this sounds all too familiar when we look at some of the crises that are in hospitals over the past few years at the moment. But we can see that even back in the late 19th century, overcrowding and lack of hospital beds and lack of resources was a major problem. In March 1879, the Guardians received a letter from a William Gillespie of East Belfast stating, and I quote, I've just left number 17 ward of the hospital and I've been there for 17 days. The bed I was put in was in the most disgusting state, crawling with vermin, and on speaking to the other patients, I found that this state of things was something general. I directed the attention of the nurse, but got no redress. I would have spoken to the doctors, but they didn't enter into conversation with me. From the stench in the place, I lost my appetite, and when I left the workhouse, was more sick than I was when I entered it. So here's one inmate who definitely wasn't happy with the level of treatment that he received. So far then, the pictures quite gloomy, lots of doom and gloom. The workhouse was a horrific place to be if you were ill, especially a heavily overcrowded metropolitan workhouse. But I think it is important to realise that by the very close of the 19th century and the opening years of the 20th century, the workhouse saw a dramatic change in the way in which its hospitals were managed. I actually think a lot of that's down to the fact that for the first time, women were enabled to be elected as poor law guardians. And the women who were elected as guardians in Belfast Workhouse made an enormous difference. They established committees, they visited the workhouse on a regular basis, and suddenly there's a sense in which this is being taken seriously, and changes were really made for the better. And what we can see across the country is as the workhouse hospital becomes an increasingly important part of providing medical welfare for the poorer sections in society, then the workhouse responds, and more money and more resources are put into actually improving the situation within the workhouse. In Belfast, possibly one of the most important, sorry, I just stop there and show you. There's Belfast Workhouse, 1900. This was Christmas Day, and this is the children's ward. And you can see by now the children are in their own beds. Each one has an individual bed. And if you look down at the back of the room, there's a very ominous looking Santa Claus there distributing gifts to the children. But I'd say by the early 1900s, the most important part that the workhouse played in the development of medicine and healthcare in the city was actually in training medical staff. The idea of the workhouse hospital being used for the training of medical students was actually first raised right back in 1856 with the introduction of the Queen's Colleges Bill. And what this sought to do was to extend the provisions of the Act of 1845, under which Ireland's 3 Queen's Colleges were established to allow for the practical medical training of the students within those. So Queen's College, Queen's University as it now is, was one of those 3 colleges. And the idea was that the medical school within Queen's University should use Belfast Workhouse Hospital as a means of giving students an opportunity for practical experience of caring for sick patients. However, Belfast poor law guardians were firmly opposed to the idea, something they absolutely wanted nothing to do with. They didn't like the idea of students traipsing through their wards. They didn't like the idea that Queen's medical staff would have any kind of say over their jurisdiction, the workhouse hospital. So I think there's a bit of territorial play going on there as well in terms of responsibility. But the long and short of it was that by the end of the century, the Guardians voted to allow medical students into the workhouse, and that actually really kick-started the process of training medical students in the hospital and the gradual development of the workhouse infirmary into a training hospital, which it still is today. In 1884, for the first time, workhouse nurses were provided with a uniform. In 1887, 6 young women were admitted to serve as nursing probationers, and this is the first time that this had happened. They were given 3 years as probationers, and after this, they would be absorbed into the nursing staff. So rather than using pauper inmates, as it were, for the first time, we're seeing professional nurses being employed by the workhouse. And actually using the workhouse as a means of training those nurses as well. In 1889, the first trainee nurse sat an examination in Dublin, and by 1901, the workhouse hospital was operating as a full-scale training centre. In February 1901, the Guardians noted that 16 nurses had passed their medical, surgical and fever nursing examination, which was held by the board examiners. And they were each awarded a pay rise. The same month, 8 new nurses were admitted as probationers, and in July of that year, it was announced, I quote, "All candidates for the position of probationer nurse must pass a preliminary examination in arithmetic, writing and spelling, and this will be conducted periodically by visiting medical officers." So really seeing now professionalisation of nursing in the workhouse hospital. And just to close then, to give you a sense of by the end of the century, December 1900 here, this is just 1 out of 3 departments in the workhouse hospital, but you can see there from the numbers the range of treatments, from injuries through to surgical diseases, including tumours. There was a lot of cancer treatment being developed at the time, as well as alcoholism and others as well there. And you can see the numbers, as I say, that's just 1 out of 3 departments, and that's just for 6 months. So by the early 20th century then, the hospital is treating large numbers of cases. And here we have the numbers being treated in the infirmary. In 1897, it was over 10,000. The following year, we're up to 11,000. 1889, 12,000, and by 1900, nearly 20,000 cases in that 1 year. So you can see then just how important the hospital became, the workhouse hospital. So the workhouse becoming an important place of refuge for a whole range of people that were never intended by those who established the poor law in the first place. And it's also interesting to see the development of medical treatment. And I'll just finish, might surprise you here to see a picture of the Eiffel Tower. It's very different from Belfast City Hospital Tower. One thing that struck me as really curious was in 1896 to discover that Belfast poor law guardians were sending people to Paris for treatment for rabies. So on several occasions I came across young people who had been bitten by rabid dogs, and they would be taken by one of the workhouse officials to Paris for a fortnight's treatment in the Pasteur Institute and then brought home again. So not bad in terms of some of the treatment that people were able to receive under the poor law in those days. So we can see, therefore, the shift from pauperizing, stigmatizing form of welfare to something that was becoming quite central to survival in the city in the early years of the 19th century. Sorry, 20th century. So I'm going to stop there because I know there'll be lots of questions and I'd really like to leave some space for discussion. But thanks for listening to me.